Hello and welcome back to another video. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we'll be discussing the current situation across the front line and future Russian offensives in the southern and eastern section of the front line. We'll be doing an in-depth analysis on the different sections of the front line, such as the Zaporizhzhia front, the Donetsk front, the Osk River line front, the Kharkiv front, and the Kursk region in this video. We'll also go quickly over the Kherson region for an in-depth analysis on what we will be seeing in the next few months. The war is obviously not ending. It has already been the 24 hours or the 2 days or whatever Trump said he would end the war in. He's gone over to say half a year, and it'll likely take longer because the situation simply is not that simple, ironically. The Russians want to gain full control over the four regions. For this, they would have to capture the remaining parts of the Donetsk region, the Zaporizhzhia region, and the Kherson region. They also want to regain full control over the Kursk region. Those are areas that the Russians want to control. What Trump is offering is a ceasefire at the current front lines. This means it is simply a delay of the war, because the Russians want these areas because they've annexed them, and the Ukrainians want to regain these positions. So as long as the Russian goals are not met, they will not stop the war, and the Ukrainians want to achieve their own goals, but they are simply unable to do so at the current trend. This means something has to change for that to happen. Therefore, as we see it right now, as Putin sees it, as Zelensky sees it, and as Trump sees it, at this rate, the current situation, the Russians will win. I believe anyone can see that. The Russians will be able to achieve their goals, whether it is in a few months or many years, we do not know. But at the current rate, the Russians will achieve their goals. Therefore, the negotiation will not happen as long as Russia is convinced they'll achieve their goals, and as long as those negotiations does not provide the Russians with what they believe that they will gain or what is equivalent to that. And therefore, right now, we are at an impasse in terms of the negotiations, and they cannot take place as the situation stands right now. Therefore, we have to analyze what is going to happen in the future, either for the negotiations to take place or for the war to end. For that, we need to analyze the frontline positions and the goals. We have two types of colors for the Russians and for the Ukrainians. The light blue color for the Ukrainians are areas that the Russians have not annexed, therefore they do not have that as a war goal. The dark blue colors are the areas the Russians have annexed and therefore need to control for the war to end, for the Russian side. Therefore, we have these two discrepancies with the colors of the Ukrainian side. As for the Russian side, it is the same. The difference is the orange color is areas that they occupy but have not annexed. The red colors are areas that they occupy and have annexed. This faded color is simply because it's no longer a front line, but it's still an area that the Russians have annexed and part of Ukrainian territory. And Crimea itself is simply not colored because of how far away it is from the front line, similar to how the Dnieper regions and other regions in the Ukraine has not been colored yet. So we take a look at the different front lines, and we also see that the Kursk region is similar to the annexed region of Russia, simply because it is in the eyes of the Russians the same. Starting out in the Kherson region, we see that it is unrealistic for any significant operations to take place here simply because of the Dnieper River. The Russians like to experiment, so do the Ukrainians, and that is why we have seen multiple offensives in different styles and different tactics, different strategies, and so on. An example is the Ukrainian Krinky offensive, which was an offensive that took place over many months. The Ukrainians attempted to get a foothold and bridgehead across Dnieper River by landing in the town of Krinky. They fought over the town for many months. They lost hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers. Of course, the Ukrainian propaganda machine claims that the Russians took more casualties than the Ukrainians, which they always claim. However, it is extremely unrealistic for that to be the case, simply due to the fact that the Ukrainians had to send infantry across with no armored support to a crossing across a large and wide river line where the Russians were sitting in trenches and fortified positions, waiting for the Ukrainians to arrive and hitting them with artillery and FPV drones and so on, completely bombarding the Ukrainian positions out of existence. This is naturally what would happen if the Russians attempted the same, which is why they have not attempted the same. The Russians take the results that the Ukrainians achieve as the results they themselves would achieve, and therefore they see that a repeat of what Ukraine has done would likely end in the same manner that Ukraine has ended in, and therefore they will not attempt such an operation. This means it will have to be a different operation, and so far there's no position across the Dnieper River at which the Russians can achieve or attempt any operation across towards the city of Kherson or the general area of the Kherson region that is under Ukrainian control. Therefore, as the situation stands right now, there's simply no indication that anything will happen across the Dnieper River, and it is likely that this will simply be artillery deals. The only thing that could change that in my eyes is if either side, the Russians or the Ukrainians, would simply redirect their forces to another section of the front line, leaving gaps in the defenses. This is more likely to happen for the Ukrainians because the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in multiple sectors of the front line, which means that the Russians simply would have no need to redirect their forces from the Kherson region, while the Ukrainians would have several reasons to do so. The Zaporizhzhia region is similar yet different. What we see in the Zaporizhzhia region is that there is a standoff between the Russian positions and the Ukrainian positions. All of these yellow colors that we see both on the Russian and the Ukrainian side consist of 4 different fortified elements. There are anti-tank ditches, which are long connected lines, such as this one, where the defending side has built a long, connected, and wide trench that is deep, that tanks simply cannot drive through. And similarly, the other connected line that is usually side by side with the anti-tank ditches are typically these dragon teeth fortifications, which are large concrete blocks in a pyramid shape, which are supposed to slow down or completely stop tanks from moving through. So these are 2 separate fortified entities that are supposed to simply stop tanks as much as possible. That is beside minefields that we will not be covering because they are practically anywhere and everywhere across the entire front line. Anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, they are everywhere, scattered everywhere. No operation is taking place without having to pass through those. The other 2 elements that we'll be talking about is normal trenches, which are simply areas the defending side has built holes, infantry sit in them, and if they see an enemy, they shoot from their hole. This provides cover for the infantry if it's an open field, if it's a mountain, whatever the area is. In a trench, they are somewhat safe from long-range distance fire, and therefore the attacking side would have to go inside the trench and clear it to clear the trench, and then they can use it themselves for defensive operations once they've captured territory. And the final type is firing positions. Similar as we see here, these weird square-shaped fortifications are typically firing positions. They are a sort of trench that is suitable for vehicles rather than infantry. So it's a larger square-shaped, typically or rectangular trench that is used for tanks or artillery and other vehicles with long-range fire, where they can sit in these positions and they'll be protected for any indirect fire. If an artillery hits nearby, the dirt around the tank will defend it, and therefore it will not be destroyed. Whereas in a tank out in the open, it could be hit by fragments, and if the fragments hit a correct area or penetrates the armor, the tank will be destroyed. And this simply does not happen when they are in a firing position. You'd need to get hit by a direct strike, and that increases the survivability of the vehicles. Unfortunately, I did not have any readily available footage of those defensive positions, the tank trenches, dugouts, whatever you want to call them. But there is this satellite imagery here where it shows one of these positions. We see that there are dirt around the areas, and then the tank can move in to this position and shoot from it. Then it can drive off again. There are several different types. We see some trenches and so on. All of these are built across the river line in the Karolivka reservoir, which is one of the areas that the Russians captured. Following the capture of Avdiivka, we see one of these well-fortified positions here. With that in mind, we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians have several layers of defensive lines in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, from the very eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region to the western outskirts along the Dnieper River. There is no gaps in these defenses. The Russians and the Ukrainians have large concentrations of forces in this area as well, which makes it extremely difficult to break through. In other areas of the front line, there are more sporadic defenses, like in the Donetsk section of the front line, where the Russians could simply fight over one fortified position after another and did not have to fight over a comprehensive line. This allowed for significant advances by the Russians. While in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, these are all well connected. What difference does that make? It makes a massive difference, because how will the Russians or the Ukrainians ever break through the front line? Well, that is done by concentrating your forces. If the Russians concentrate their forces in one area, they can break through the defenses, and they'll be able to capture the rest of the defenses by flanking them from the rear. However, concentrating your forces while in modern warfare means that you are exposed to MLRS strikes, artillery strikes, airplanes, and everything else that can destroy these units, because there are constantly drones flying around, satellite imagery and so on, that detects any large movement. Therefore, neither side is able to concentrate a large grouping of forces, and this makes it extremely difficult to push through and break through a front line. Therefore, what we are instead seeing is that small groups of forces attack different areas bit by bit, whether it is a squad of up to 12 soldiers, a few armored vehicles between 4 or 5, or whatever the grouping is. It is usually a small one, and that is also very difficult in this section of the front line, because the Ukrainians have just as many soldiers concentrated. That means if the Russians attempt to launch an operation on a wide front, then the Ukrainians will have a wide front response. They'll be able to send FPV drones and artillery in every single one of these groupings, and because they are small groupings, then the Ukrainians will have enough firepower even if they are significantly outgunned by the Russians. Therefore, realistically speaking, the objective of the Russians would be to create a very large grouping of forces that is spread thinly across the front line and attack simultaneously on a wide front to achieve some sort of success in this section of the front line. And that is simply unrealistic, because the Russians are not significantly outnumbering the Ukrainians in this section of the front line. It is more on par with each other, and therefore it is unlikely that a significant offensive will take place in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line until either one of two cases happen. Either the Russians finish an offensive operation in a different section of the front line, such as the Donetsk region or the Kherson region, and those troops are all relocated to the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line to form a strike group, or the second is that the Russians continue recruiting forces, do not take that many losses, and those forces are then relocated to that section of the front line to form a strike group. In either case, the Russians would need more soldiers and more firepower to launch such an operation, and would need local air supremacy for proper air support. The Ukrainians are unable to get that. And therefore, a Zaporizhzhia offensive is also extremely unrealistic at the time being, due to the Russian focus being the Donetsk region and the Kursk region being well prioritized over the Zaporizhzhia region. Even the Kupiansk section of the front line is significantly more prioritized than the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line. An alternative is the Russians push through enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region, launch an operation through there to bypass the defensive lines, but even there the Ukrainians are now building new defensive lines to protect that and avoid such an operation, and they're also building additional defensive lines to surround Zaporizhzhia completely on all sides, with defensive positions, turning it into a complete stronghold city. And therefore, at the time being, no offensive operation will take place in the Zaporizhzhia direction, nor the Kherson direction. Therefore, the southern section of the front line will not see any significant developments at the time being, until changes happen. As for the eastern section of the front line, both the Donetsk region and the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Uskrivoye section of the front line, as well as the Kursk region, Kharkiv direction, will all be left for later videos, as for this one to not be too long. And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.